The blue light of the laptop was the only thing that felt real. Around the dinner table, the air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and the even heavier weight of her family's disappointment. Sloane Mercer sat in the center of the noise, a quiet ghost amidst the clattering of silverware and the droning of her aunt's lecture on finding a stable career. She moved with practiced efficiency, nodding at the right times, her expression placid while a storm of green code reflections danced invisibly behind her eyes. To them, she was a failure. To the world outside, she didn't exist. Then, the heavy thud of a car door echoed from the driveway, a sharp, dissonant sound that cut through the family's bickering. The room fell silent. He walked in first, a man carved from shadow and gold. Seo Jae-Hyun didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a king. His black suit was tailored so precisely it seemed a part of him, and his presence brought a sudden, dangerous pressure to the small dining room. While her family shrank back in confusion, Sloane felt a strange, cold calm settle in her veins. He didn't look at the others. He walked straight to her and dropped a heavy black folder onto the table. "I don't care about your history," he said, his voice a low, commanding rasp. "I care about your value. I have $1 million problem, and you're the only one smart enough to solve it." Sloane Mercer's bedroom was a sanctuary of cold, blue silicone and the low hum of cooling fans, while the rest of the house exhaled the heavy, spice-laden scent of a dinner that had just been disrupted by a god. Sloane sat in the stillness of her desk, and her fingers hovering over a mechanical keyboard. To her parents, this room was a tomb of wasted potential, a dark cave where their daughter buried her life in screens and flickering lines of green light. They saw a young woman who had walked away from a prestigious internship, someone who couldn't hold a stable corporate job, a failure who spent her days in hoodies and silence. But Sloane didn't see failure. She saw geometry. To her, the world wasn't made of people or promises. It was made of systems. The electrical grid, the flow of capital, the encrypted handshakes of secure servers, they all had a shape. Most people walked through life seeing only the walls, but Sloane saw the blueprints. She saw where the load-bearing beams were weak. She saw the cracks in the foundation of empires that thought they were untouchable. She leaned back, and the blue light of 3 monitors reflecting across her deep brown skin. On the center screen, a complex web of financial transactions pulsed like a living heart. This was the leak she had mentioned to Seo Jae-Hyun. It wasn't just a simple theft. It was a work of art. Someone was bleeding Jae-Hyun's accounts using a high-frequency ghost protocol, moving pennies at a rate of 10,000 times per second. It was invisible to the standard auditors, but to Sloane, it was a glaring neon sign. It was a serpent coiled in the code. Her mother's voice suddenly cut through the hum, muffled by the bedroom door. "Sloane, who was that man? What have you done?" Sloane didn't blink. She didn't feel the need to explain that the man was the only person who had looked at her and seen a weapon instead of a disappointment. Her family valued titles, the dental plans, and the safety of the known. They didn't understand that the world was changing, that power was no longer held by the loudest voice in the room, but by the one who controlled the data. She reached out and touched the folder Jae-Hyun had left on her desk. It felt heavy, a physical manifestation of a world she had only ever touched through a glass screen. Inside, she knew there would be more than just a contract. There would be coordinates, names, and the keys to a kingdom that was currently burning. The geometry of failure was a label they had given her, but as she opened the folder and began to cross-reference the data with her active scans, Sloane realized that failure was just a matter of perspective. In the old world, she was a ghost. In the new world Jae-Hyun was offering, she was the architect. The cursor blinked, and a steady heartbeat in the dark. Sloane began to type, her movements fluid and economical. She wasn't just solving a problem for $1 million. She was beginning the process of dismantling every person who had ever looked at her and seen nothing. The code began to flow, a river of logic that would soon become a flood. By morning, the serpent would be trapped, and the girl they called a failure would be the only thing standing between an empire and its end. Seo Jae-Hyun did not wait for an answer. He turned with the practiced grace of a man who assumed the world would naturally adjust its orbit to follow him, and Sloane found herself moving. She didn't look back at the stunned, open-mouthed silence of her family. She didn't need to see her mother's hand pressed against her chest or hear her aunt's sputtered protest. That world was already receding, becoming nothing more than a blurred background to the sharp, gold-etched reality of the man walking ahead of her. The night air was crisp, tasting of rain and expensive exhaust. A sleek, matte black sedan waited at the curb, its engine purring with a predatory low-frequency hum. One of the stone-faced men held the door open, his gaze fixed on the horizon, ignoring her as if she were already part of the machinery. Sloane stepped into the interior, and the door closed with a heavy, pressurized thud that severed the last cord connecting her to her old life. Inside, the car was a sanctuary of dark leather and amber light. Jae-Hyun sat in the corner, his silhouette framed by the golden glow of the city passing by the window. He didn't speak until the car was in motion, weaving through the late-night traffic with aggressive precision. "My organization is built on legacy," Jae-Hyun said, his voice smooth and devoid of heat. "We control the ports, the high-end real estate, and the digital flow of 3 major banks. But legacy is a heavy thing, Sloane. It's slow. It has blind spots." He turned his head, his sharp jawline catching the light. "Someone has found those spots. They aren't using guns or bribes. They're using a ghost protocol to siphon my liquidity faster than my accountants can track it. It's a surgical strike, an architect's move." Sloane kept her posture upright, her hands folded in her lap. She felt the cool blue light of her phone in her pocket, a tether to the digital world she had used to track him before he ever found her. "You didn't come to me because you needed an accountant," she said, so her voice steady. "You came to me because you realize the person hurting you isn't a criminal, they're a mathematician." A ghost of a smile touched Jae-Hyun's lips, not one of warmth, but of recognition. "Exactly. I have thousands of men who can break bones. I have none who can see the geometry of a digital execution. I need someone who exists outside the system, someone who has been called a failure because she refuses to play by the rules of people who are too slow to see what's coming." He leaned forward, the gold ring on his finger glinting in the dim light. "The $1 million is a retainer. If you find the leak and dismantle the rival who sent it, you will never have to listen to your family's disappointment again. You won't just be an employee, Sloane. You will be the mind behind the throne." As the car swept toward the shimmering glass towers of the city's heart, Sloane looked at the man in the golden shadow. He was dangerous, a king of a world she had only viewed from a distance. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't being looked through. She was being seen. "Show me the servers," she said. Jae-Hyun tapped a control on the armrest, and a holographic display bloomed between them, a chaotic web of red-lined data. "Welcome to the war, architect." The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and cold blue geometry, overlooking a city that looked like a motherboard from 60 stories up. As the elevator doors hissed shut, Sloane stepped into the heart of Seo Jae-Hyun's operations. The air here was different, filtered, thin, and humming with the vibration of high-tier servers. Jae-Hyun walked toward a massive table carved from a single slab of obsidian, his presence drawing the light of the room toward him like a gravitational pull. He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't offer her a drink. He simply gestured to the sprawling array of monitors that occupied the far wall. They were filled with the red line hemorrhaging of his capital, a digital bleed that was accelerating. "The question isn't whether you can stop this," Jae-Hyun said, his voice echoing slightly against the glass. He stood with his back to her, watching the city he claimed to own. "The question is why you haven't already. You saw the leak days ago. I've tracked your pings. You were inside my firewall before I even knew your name." Sloane didn't flinch. She walked to the obsidian table, her movements steady. She pulled her laptop from her bag, a battered, sticker-covered machine that looked like a relic in this temple of gold and steel. She plugged it into the main hub, her fingers dancing across the keys with a clinical speed that made no sound. I didn't stop it because I didn't have a reason to care, Sloane replied, her voice a cool contrast to his intensity. To my family, I'm a failure because I don't produce a paycheck. To me, your empire was just a complex puzzle. I wanted to see how the serpent moved before I decided whether to kill it. Jae-Hyun turned, his unreadable eyes narrowing as he watched her work. The gold light from the city reflected off his sharp jawline, casting him in an intimidating glow. And now? Sloane paused, a single line of green code reflecting across her cheekbones. She looked up, her gaze meeting his with a prove me wrong intensity. Now, you've offered me $1 million and a stage, but the $1 million isn't the point. The point is the scale of the dismantle. She tapped a final key, and the red lines on the monitors froze. I can save your money, Jae-Hyun, but if I do, I don't just want the retainer. I want the authority to burn the person who did this to the ground. I don't work for people who negotiate with their enemies. The silence in the room became a pressurized weight. It was the $1 million question. Was she a tool he was hiring or a partner he was unleashing? Jae-Hyun walked toward her, stopping only when he was close enough for her to smell the faint scent of sandalwood and danger. He looked down at her laptop, then back at her steady dark eyes. I'm not paying you to be a shield. Sloane, he whispered, a dangerous grin finally breaking the stillness of his face. I'm paying you to be the sword. The $1 million is yours the moment the first head rolls. Do we have a deal? Sloane didn't hesitate. She reached out and closed the folder he had given her earlier, her hand resting on it with a sense of finality. Don't blink, Jae-Hyun. This is going to be surgical. The transition was marked not by a sudden explosion, but by a quiet, clinical shedding of her former skin. Sloane sat in the passenger seat of one of Jae-Hyun's secondary vehicles, a nondescript silver sedan that blended into the city's midnight fog, watching the familiar landmarks of her old life dissolve in the rearview mirror. They passed the park where she used to sit with her laptop, hiding from her family's judgmental eyes, and the grocery store where she'd counted coins just a week ago. Those places felt like artifacts from a prehistoric era. She looked down at her hands. They were steady. The blue light from the dashboard caught the deep brown of her skin, highlighting the calm, analytical stillness that had always been mistaken for apathy. In the seat beside her, Jae-Hyun remained a silent, golden-etched silhouette. He didn't offer platitudes about her new beginning. He understood, better than anyone, that Sloane wasn't starting over. She was finally being allowed to exist. There is a tailored suit waiting for you at the safe house, Jae-Hyun said, his voice cutting through the hum of the tires, and a secure terminal. From this moment, Sloane Mercer is a ghost. You don't exist in the social registers, the tax records, or the family trees. You are simply the architect. I've been a ghost for years, Jae-Hyun, Sloane replied, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The only difference is that now, the ghost has a budget. The safe house was a brutalist structure of concrete and reinforced glass, hidden in plain sight within the city's industrial district. Inside, the transition became physical. She stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, discarding the worn hoodie and the failure persona it represented. The new suit was charcoal gray, the fabric so fine it felt like a second layer of protection. It fit her with a sharp, geometric precision, squaring her shoulders and emphasizing the stability of her posture. When she pulled her hair back tightly and looked at her reflection, she didn't see the girl who had been belittled at a dinner table. She saw a strategist ready to dismantle an empire. She walked into the adjoining room where a workstation waited. It was a masterpiece of liquid-cooled hardware and encrypted uplinks. As she sat down, the familiar green code reflections began to dance across her cheekbones, but this time, they weren't hidden. Jae-Hyun stood in the doorway, watching her with that unreadable, decisive expression. He didn't look impressed. He looked validated. He had made $1 billion bet on a woman the world had discarded, and as her fingers hit the keys, the first ripples of her presence began to move through the city's digital underbelly. The Serpent thinks he's playing against a wounded king, Sloane muttered, the first lines of a counterstrike blooming on the monitors. He has no idea he's actually playing against the person who built the board. With a final, decisive keystroke, she severed the last digital link to her family's home network. The failure was dead. The architect had arrived. The room was cold, the light was blue, and for the first time in her life, Sloane Mercer was exactly where she was meant to be. The first real test came not with a gunshot, but with a flickering of the high-altitude lights in Jae-Hyun's secondary war room. Sloane didn't look up from her monitors as the emergency generators kicked in with a low, gravelly hum. She felt Jae-Hyun's presence behind her, a silent, golden shadow radiating a sudden, sharp tension. Across the city, the rivals' first strike wasn't hitting the streets. It was hitting the bedrock of Jae-Hyun's logistics. "The port's automated crane system just went dark." Jae-Hyun's voice was a low, dangerous rasp. $30 million in cargo is sitting idle, and 3 of my men are trapped in the control tower. My security team says the override is locked from the inside. Sloane's fingers moved with a clinical, rhythmic precision that mocked the chaos. "They aren't just locking you out, Jae-Hyun. They're running a logic bomb. In 3 minutes, the system will execute a command to drop every suspended container. It's not a theft. It's an execution." Jae-Hyun leaned over her, his squared shoulders casting a long shadow across her keyboard. "Stop it. Now." It was a command born of old power, the kind that expected immediate obedience through sheer force of will. But Sloane didn't flinch. She was immersed in a world of blue light and cascading green text, where his authority held no currency. "Power won't fix a broken algorithm," she said, her voice a cool, steady anchor. "You can send 100 men with sledgehammers to that port, and they'll still be standing over a graveyard of crushed steel. Logic is the only thing that moves the needle now." She watched the red line warnings on her screen, her dark eyes reflecting the frantic pulse of the attack. The rival's Serpent was clever. He had built a labyrinth of decoy protocols, a digital shell game designed to waste her time. But Sloane saw the geometry of the trap. She saw the one load-bearing line of code that held the entire structure together. 30 seconds, Jae-Hyun muttered, his hand resting on the hilt of a decorative blade on the obsidian table, his jawline tight with a frustration he couldn't vent. "I don't need 30, Sloane replied. With a slight, challenging tilt of her head, she executed a ghost injection, a piece of code she had written in her bedroom years ago when she was just a failure, looking for a way to breathe. The monitors flashed white, then settled into a calm, steady blue. The flickering lights in the war room stabilized. Across the city, the massive steel cranes at the port hummed back to life, their lethal payloads held firmly in place. Sloane leaned back, her deep brown skin glowing in the light of the successful override. She didn't look for praise, she looked for the next move. Jae-Hyun stood silent, the intimidation in his posture replaced by a calculated, unreadable respect. He had seen brute force fail, where her quiet disruption had succeeded. "The Serpent just realized someone else is on the board," she said, her gaze returning to the data. "He was expecting a Mafia boss. He didn't prepare for an architect." Jae-Hyun straightened his tailored jacket, the gold on his wrist glinting as he finally stepped back, giving her the space she had earned. "Keep going," he said, his voice no longer commanding, but acknowledging. "Dismantle him." The digital landscape was a shimmering, endless grid of architecture, but somewhere within the geometry of Jae-Hyun's empire, a foreign entity was nesting. Sloane sat in the absolute stillness of the workstation, the cool blue light of the monitors washing over her face while the rest of the world slept. She wasn't looking for a file or a missing sum of money anymore. She was hunting a ghost. She began to peel back the layers of the organization's primary server, her fingers moving with a rhythmic, percussive grace. To anyone else, the data was a mountain of noise, but to Sloane, it was a song with a dissonant note. There, buried in the subroutines of the payroll encryption, she found it. It wasn't just a virus, it was a mirror. The rival, the Serpent, hadn't just hacked the system, he had duplicated it, creating a shadow server that lived inside the real one, siphoning information and authority in real time. "Clever," she whispered, the green code reflections under her eyes intensifying. "You didn't break the door down. You replaced the hinges." As she traced the shadow server's umbilical cord, she realized the Serpent was more than a common thief. He was a voyeur. He was watching Jae-Hyun's every move. Listening to every digital breath the organization took. He was currently extracting the shipping manifests for the next 3 months, the lifeblood of Jae-Hyun's legitimacy. She felt a presence behind her. Jae-Hyun had entered the room without a sound, his black silk shirt reflecting the amber glow of the server racks. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, his gaze fixed on the red pulses on her screen. "You found him," Jae-Hyun said, his voice a low vibration. "I found his nest," Sloane corrected. "He's been here for months, Jae-Hyun. He knows your roots, your buyers, and your debts. He's not just stealing your money. He's preparing to step into your shoes and wait for you to notice they don't fit." Jae-Hyun's jaw tightened, the sharp line of his profile catching the light. "Kill it. I wipe the server and burn the connection." "No," Sloane said, her gaze never wavering from the screen. "If I kill it now, he'll just build another one elsewhere. He'll know we're onto him, and he'll go deeper into the dark." She turned her chair slightly, her analytical eyes meeting his unreadable ones. "I'm going to feed the Serpent. I'm going to give him exactly what he wants, a manifest for a ghost ship that doesn't exist, heading toward a trap he can't see." A cold, decisive understanding passed between them. Jae-Hyun didn't need to speak twice. He saw the strategic brilliance of the move. He wasn't just hiring a coder, he was watching a master architect redraw the map of his war. "How long?" he asked. "He thinks he's in control," Sloane replied, her fingers returning to the keys. "Let him feel powerful for 1 more hour. By dawn, he won't be in your server anymore. He'll be in mine." The blue light intensified as she began the ghost feed, her heart steady and her mind clear. The girl they had called a failure was no longer just protecting an empire. She was designing its survival, 1 line of code at a time. The air in the war room grew cold, the hum of the servers rising to a fever pitch as the trap finally snapped shut. Sloane didn't move. Her fingers were poised over the keys, her dark, expressive eyes reflecting a sudden eruption of crimson light on the monitors. The ghost feed had been swallowed whole, but the Serpent wasn't just retreating, he was retaliating. This wasn't a digital probe, it was a scorched earth ambush. "He's tripped the failsafe," Sloane said, her voice a calm, clinical anchor in the rising storm. "He's not just trying to steal your data anymore, Jae-Hyun. He's trying to overload the city's power grid nodes connected to your shipping hubs. He's aiming for a physical blackout to cover a breach at the main warehouse." Jae-Hyun moved with the lethal grace of a predator, his squared shoulders casting a long shadow over the obsidian table. He reached for his phone, his jawline tight as he prepared to mobilize his soldiers. "I'll have 50 men there in 10 minutes. "They won't make it through the gates," Sloane countered, her gaze never leaving the cascading lines of code. "He's locked the smart traffic lights for 3 miles. Your men are sitting ducks in a gridlock. This is a symphony, Jae-Hyun, and you're just the percussion." She didn't wait for his permission. The green code reflections under her eyes turned into a blur of motion. While the rival thought he was fighting a Mafia boss with brute force, Sloane was redrawing the battlefield. She executed a logic cascade, a sequence of commands that didn't just fight the Serpent's breach, but fed it false feedback loops. On the monitors, a digital map of the city's infrastructure glowed blue. Sloane began to play the Serpent's own weapons against him. She hijacked the security drones the rival had subverted, flipping their recognition software to target the intruders instead of the guards. She flooded the rival's communication channels with white noise, a high-frequency digital scream that rendered their headsets useless. "The warehouse gates are opening," Jae-Hyun noted, his eyes fixed on a live thermal feed. "But not for them." "I'm venting the fire suppression system," Sloane muttered, a slight, unchallenging tilt to her head. "They won't be able to see their own hands in front of their faces, let alone the servers they came to steal." The room was silent, except for the rhythmic tapping of her mechanical keyboard, a percussive beat against the backdrop of an empire in chaos. It was a symphony of digital destruction. Sloane watched as the rival's signals began to blink out one by one, like dying stars. The Serpent was losing his grip on the logic of the world. He was blind, deaf, and trapped in a maze of Sloane's design. Jae-Hyun stood beside her, his unreadable, unyielding gaze shifting from the screens to the woman who had been called a failure. He saw the stability in her posture, the mental strength that turned a laptop into a weapon of mass confusion. The golden light of the city shimmered behind him, but for the first time, he wasn't the most powerful thing in the room. "He's gone dark," Sloane finally said, leaning back as the monitors settled into a steady, victorious blue. "No," Jae-Hyun replied, his voice a low, commanding rasp. "He's just realized who the architect really is." The silence that followed the digital storm was heavier than the chaos itself. In the war room, the only sound was the cooling fans of the server racks, a low hum that felt like the city catching its breath. Sloane sat motionless, her hands finally resting on the obsidian surface of the table. The green code reflections that had pulsed so violently under her eyes just moments ago were now steady, a soft glow that illuminated the deep brown of her skin. She didn't look at the screens to confirm her victory. She already felt it in the perfect geometry of the silence. Jae-Hyun did not move toward the monitors. Instead, he walked slowly toward her, his reflection shimmering in the dark, polished floor like a king crossing a black lake. He stopped a few feet away, his squared shoulders losing their tension, his sharp jawline softening, not into a smile, but into an expression of profound, clinical respect. He looked at her not as an investment he had made, and not as the girl he had plucked from a middle-class dinner table, but as a peer. "My father built this empire with blood and iron," Jae-Hyun said, his voice a low, commanding rasp that filled the room. "He believed that power was something you seized with your hands. He would have sent 100 men to their deaths tonight trying to hold that warehouse." He turned to the window, the gold light of the city washing over him. "You didn't use a single bullet. You didn't even raise your voice. And yet, the Serpent is broken." Sloane looked up, her gaze steady and focused. "He was fighting the wrong war, Jae-Hyun. He thought the city was made of streets and buildings. He didn't realize it's made of information. I didn't beat him because I'm stronger. I beat him because I can see the shape of the system better than he can." Jae-Hyun turned back to her, and for the first time he reached out, placing a hand on the obsidian table near her laptop. It was a gesture of alignment, a bridging of their two worlds. "My family would call this a victory of technology, but I know better. This was a victory of vision." He paused, his unreadable eyes searching hers. "They called you a failure because they were looking at a weapon and trying to use it as a tool. They wanted a light bulb, but I found a sun." He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a second folder, not black this time, but deep crimson. He placed it on top of her laptop. "The $1 million has been wired to your offshore account. Consider that the end of your past. This," he gestured to the folder, "is your future. It's the keys to every encrypted bypass I own. It's the blueprint of the new empire." Sloane felt the weight of the recognition. It wasn't the money. It was the fact that for the first time in her life, the most powerful man in the room was admitting he needed her mind to keep his throne. "You aren't my consultant anymore, Sloane," Jae-Hyun said, his voice dropping to a decisive whisper. "From tonight, you are the architect of the hidden empire. What you build, I will protect. What you dismantle, and I will bury." Sloane didn't need to say thank you. She simply opened the crimson folder, her dark eyes reflecting a new set of data. The failure was gone, and in her place sat the brain of the underworld. She looked at Jae-Hyun and gave a slight, challenging nod. The king had recognized his crown. "Let's get to work," she said. "We have an empire to redraw." The transition from the shadows to the center of the world was absolute. Within a month, the cold, industrial safehouse had been replaced by a sprawling command center on the upper floors of an obsidian tower, a space that felt less like an office and more like the inside of a high-functioning mind. Sloane Mercer sat at the center of the glass and steel expanse, her deep brown skin glowing under the cool blue light of a dozen monitors. She no longer wore the oversized hoodies of a ghost or the tentative gray of a new recruit. Today, she was draped in deep navy silk, her natural hair pulled back with surgical precision, her dark eyes reflecting a landscape of data that she had personally redrawn. Beside her, Seo Jae-Hyun stood silhouetted against the city's skyline, the gold of his watch catching the sunrise. The dynamic had shifted. They no longer occupied the roles of employer and asset. They were two halves of a singular machine. While Jae-Hyun held the physical city in his iron grip, Sloane held the digital pulse that made that grip possible. "The Serpent's assets have been fully liquidated," Sloane said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the room's silence. "His offshore accounts have been rerouted, his leverage over the city's council has been erased, and his network is currently eating itself alive from the inside out. He didn't just lose his empire, Jae-Hyun, he's been deleted." Jae-Hyun turned away from the window, his unreadable, unyielding gaze settling on her with a weight that would have crushed the woman she used to be. But Sloane simply met his eyes, her posture upright and centered. She didn't need his approval to know she was valuable. She knew it because the systems she controlled were humming in perfect geometric harmony. "The other families are asking questions," Jae-Hyun said, his voice a low, commanding rasp. "They want to know how I'm anticipating their moves before they even make them. They want to know who is whispering in my ear." "Let them wonder," Sloane replied, a slight, challenging tilt to her head. "They're still looking for a man with a gun. They aren't prepared for a woman with an algorithm." Jae-Hyun walked to her desk and placed a hand on the obsidian surface, his squared shoulders losing their lethal edge for a brief moment of alignment. He looked at the monitors, where the hidden empire was laid out in a symphony of blue and green. "You've done more than save my throne, Sloane. You've evolved it." He didn't need to say more. The transformation was complete. The failure, who had sat at a dinner table listening to the small-minded judgment of relatives, was gone, buried under the weight of $1 million deal and the cold logic of an empire. Sloane Mercer was no longer an observer. She was the architect. She turned back to her monitors, her fingers hovering over the keys as the first data points of a new expansion began to bloom. The city below was waking up, unaware that every transaction, every secret, and every artery of power was now flowing through the mind of the woman they had all overlooked. "The board is clear," Sloane whispered, her eyes dancing with the reflection of a new era. "Let's see what we can build next." Jae-Hyun stood beside her, the king and his crown, watching as the sun finally broke over the city they had conquered together. The geometry of the world was finally correct.